It was the spring of 1944. The skies over Europe were a deadly arena. Blue by color, red by consequence. On April 24, 1944, a young American pilot named Lieutenant William Bill Overstreet Jr. climbed into his North American P-51 Mustang, serial number 43-24823, nicknamed Berlin Express. He was 22 years old, a Virginian by birth, a U.S. Army Air Forces pilot by duty, and a survivor by skill and by fate. That day, he would face not one, not two, but 8 German fighters, and somehow live to tell the story. This is the incredible, true account of how a single P-51 Mustang pilot outflew a sky full of enemies, defied death, and etched his name in the annals of aerial legend. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal climax. American bombers were pounding German factories, rail yards, and oil fields almost daily. But the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, still packed a deadly punch. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-19Os ruled the skies in the east and over occupied Europe. Every bombing run by U.S. heavy bombers came at a terrible cost, until the P-51 Mustang arrived. The Mustang changed everything. It was fast, sleek, and, most importantly, had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine under its hood, it could climb higher and faster than nearly any other fighter of the war. Its long, bubble-like canopy gave pilots nearly full 360-degree visibility, a crucial edge in the deadly cat-and-mouse game of aerial combat. The Germans called it Der lange Reichweite Teufel, the long-range devil. They knew that when Mustangs showed up, the odds were never in their favor. Bill Overstreet wasn't a Hollywood hero. He wasn't a household name like Pappy Boyington or Chuck Yeager. But among those who flew with him, his reputation was solid, calm, daring, precise. Born in Clifton Forge, Virginia, in 1921, Overstreet was fascinated by flight from a young age. He worked as an accountant before joining the Army Air Corps in 1942. After training in California and Texas, he earned his wings and was assigned to the 357 Fighter Group, known as the Yoxford Boys. The 357th was stationed in Leiston Airfield, Suffolk, England. They flew escort missions for the massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, striking targets deep inside Nazi territory. On April 24, 1944, Overstreet and his squadron were tasked with escorting bombers on a raid targeting industrial sites in Germany's heartland. At dawn, the airfield buzzed with noise and motion. Ground crews checked fuel lines and ammunition belts. Pilots briefed, mapped, and double-checked their parachutes. The target that day, targets near Munich, deep inside enemy airspace. Takeoff was smooth. Engines roared in unison as the Mustangs lifted into the crisp English morning, silver wings glinting in the rising sun. As they climbed to altitude and crossed the channel, the radios crackled with chatter, terse, professional, steady. Once over enemy territory, discipline tightened. Every man was alert. They reached their rendezvous point with the bombers, hundreds of aircraft filling the sky in tight formation. From above, it must have looked like a floating city of silver and steel. But lurking ahead German radar operators had already detected the incoming wave. Scramble orders were sent to Luftwaffe bases across France and Germany. Among those scrambled were pilots of JG-2 Richthofen and JG-26 Schlageter, elite fighter wings that defended the Western Front. As the bombers approached their target, flak burst around them like black blossoms in the air. Then came the call on the radio. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. The first swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-19s dived in. Their 20mm cannons opened fire, tearing through the formation. B-17 shuddered under the hits, smoke trailing from engines. The Mustangs broke formation to intercept. Overstreet dove into the melee, throttling up his Merlin engine to full power. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as his altimeter needle spun downward. He picked a Bf-109, crossing the bomber stream, lined it up, and fired a short burst. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns spat flame and lead. The tracers arced perfectly, striking the 109's fuselage. The German fighter rolled, smoked, and spiraled down. "Splash one," Overstreet called over the radio. But he had little time to celebrate. More German fighters were coming in, 8 of them, diving from above. They weren't just attacking the bombers anymore. They were after him. Overstreet looked up. The sun flashed off silver-grey wings. 8 dots, and growing larger. 8 Messerschmitts in perfect formation, dropping fast. He had seconds to react. He slammed his throttle forward, pushing the Mustang into a steep climb, trying to gain altitude. But the Germans had the advantage. They split into 2 groups of 4, a classic Luftwaffe tactic. Half would force him into evasive maneuvers, the other half would cut him off. Bullets tore past his canopy. Tracer lines streaked the sky. He felt the Mustang shudder as rounds ripped into the wings. Overstreet banked hard left, pulled up, rolled, and dove, using every ounce of his training. The Merlin engine howled. The G-forces blurred his vision. One Messerschmitt overshot him, too fast on the dive. Overstreet snapped the stick right and fired a quick burst. Hits! The German pilot bailed out as the plane burst into flames. But 7 remained. They swarmed around him like angry hornets. He dove again, twisting into a rolling spiral. The Mustang's speed built to 450 miles per hour. The horizon spun wildly, sky and earth trading places. He broke through a cloud bank and suddenly found himself alone. Or so he thought. When he leveled out, 2 of the German fighters were still on him. The rest had fallen back, low on fuel or ammo. But these 2, they weren't giving up. Overstreet was now deep over occupied France, far from his unit. He radioed, but there was no response. Likely out of range, he had no choice but to fight alone. Below, he could see the French countryside, green fields, villages, church spires. He skimmed the treetops, forcing the Germans to follow him down, low. At that altitude, the Luftwaffe's high-altitude advantage was gone. He weaved between clouds, hugged valleys, and darted over rivers. The Germans stayed close, their tracers zipping past his canopy. One bullet cracked his plexiglass windscreen. Another hit near his left wingtip. But his Mustang held together, strong and steady. The chase carried on for miles. French farmers below stopped in their fields to watch the strange aerial dance. One silver plane chased by two dark shapes, twisting and turning in the sky. By now, Overstreet was near Paris. One of the German fighters had broken off, perhaps low on fuel. But one remained, a determined ace, flying a Bf-109G, painted with black crosses and a yellow nose. The German pilot was skilled, clearly no novice. He tried to force Overstreet into a climb, then a stall, but Overstreet refused the bait. He stayed low, used his Mustang's superior handling to twist and jink. The dogfight dragged on, a deadly waltz above the rooftops of occupied France. Then, something extraordinary happened. As they flew over central Paris, the German pilot, trying to shake his American pursuer, dove toward the Eiffel Tower. Civilians below stopped and looked up, two fighters roaring toward the city. The German dove straight under one of the bridges of the Seine River, hoping the tight gap would make the Mustang crash if it tried to follow. Overstreet made a split-second decision. He followed. The roar of the Merlin engine echoed off the stone walls of the riverbank. Overstreet's heart pounded as the bridge loomed closer, a stone arch barely high enough for his wingspan. He lowered his flaps slightly, steadied his hand, and aimed for the gap. The world blurred. There was no time to think, only to act. In a flash, Berlin Express shot under the bridge of the Seine, mere feet above the water, and out the other side. Crowds along the river gasped. The German pilot, now desperate, pulled up sharply. Too sharply. Overstreet squeezed his trigger and fired. His .50 caliber rounds ripped into the Messerschmitt. Flames erupted from its engine. The German aircraft rolled, then plunged into the river. Silence. Then the roar of the Mustang climbing back into the clouds, the lone victor in a battle that defied all odds. Overstreet was now deep over enemy territory, low on fuel, and completely alone. But fortune, and perhaps fate, were on his side. He turned west, climbed to altitude, and set course for England. French resistance members who had seen the incredible chase would later tell their stories to Allied forces. By the time Overstreet crossed the English Channel, his fuel gauges were nearly empty. He glided into Leiston airfield just as the sun was setting, engine sputtering. His squadron mates couldn't believe what they heard. 8 German fighters, and he'd come back alive. When he told them how he'd flown under a bridge in Paris, some laughed. Others shook their heads. But the story spread, first among pilots, then across bases, then across the Atlantic. Officially, Overstreet's daring maneuver under the bridge wasn't recorded in his mission report. It sounded too unbelievable. But the French resistance later confirmed it. After the liberation of Paris, witnesses described the scene in detail. They remembered the silver plane chasing the German through the city, the roar of engines echoing through the streets, and the impossible dive beneath the bridge. For the French living under Nazi occupation, that moment became a symbol, a flash of hope in dark times. An American pilot defying the occupiers in the very heart of their empire. After the war, Overstreet returned home quietly. He continued to fly, but rarely spoke of that day. In later interviews, he often downplayed it, saying only, "I was just doing my job. I had a plane that could do it, and I did what I had to." But those who knew him, and those who knew the skies, understood. What he did that day was not just skill. It was courage, instinct, and a touch of madness, the kind that separates survivors from legends. To truly understand Overstreet's survival, we need to understand his aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. Designed initially as a British request, it became one of America's most successful fighters. Its key features made it deadly: a supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, giving it a top speed of over 440 miles per hour, a range of more than 1,600 miles with drop tanks, 6.50 caliber machine guns with nearly 2,000 rounds, excellent maneuverability, stability, and visibility. It could fight at high altitudes, dive fast, and turn sharply. And unlike many fighters, it handled beautifully, even when pushed to its limits. German pilots both respected and feared it. Many Luftwaffe veterans later said, "When we saw the Mustangs, we knew our time was short." The P-51 wasn't invincible, but in the hands of a skilled pilot like Overstreet, it was nearly untouchable. For the Luftwaffe, encounters like this one were demoralizing. By 1944, Germany's experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages, bomber raids on training facilities, and relentless Allied pressure had worn them down. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were flying better machines, in greater numbers, with pilots who could rest, recover, and return to battle. Stories of Mustangs tearing through formations, diving from the sun, and chasing German fighters all the way to the ground spread through the Luftwaffe ranks. One captured German pilot reportedly told his interrogators, "The Mustang pilots, they don't give up. They chase you like hunters all the way down." Overstreet's flight under the bridge became part of that growing legend, proof that American pilots were willing to take impossible risks to win. In retrospect, Overstreet's mission was more than just an air battle. It symbolized the larger struggle of the war, a single man facing overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender, using courage and ingenuity to prevail. The story reached France, then Britain, then America. Though many dismissed it as wartime rumor, the tale inspired countless others. Even the French resistance celebrated it in their underground press, describing a brave American pilot who defied the German eagle above the Seine. In 2009, decades later, the French government honored Bill Overstreet Jr. with the Légion d'honneur, France's highest award, for his courage and the inspiration he gave to Parisians living under Nazi rule. He accepted the medal humbly, saying, "I didn't do anything others wouldn't have done. I was just lucky enough to make it home." The Mustang Berlin Express was eventually lost in another mission later that year, shot down in combat. But its name and its pilot's story lived on. Lieutenant William Overstreet Jr. passed away in 2014 at the age of 92. He remained modest about his achievements, but to aviators and historians, his name stands among the greats. The story of the lone P-51 pilot who faced 8 German fighters and lived is not just a tale of war. It's a lesson in courage, in doing the unthinkable when everything seems lost. When future pilots study air combat, they study tactics and maneuvers. But they also study willpower, the kind that pushes a man to dive under a bridge at 400 miles per hour, because turning back was never an option. And that's what makes Bill Overstreet's flight not just history, but legend. To understand how Lieutenant Bill Overstreet survived against 8 German fighters, we need to step inside his cockpit and into his mind. Dogfighting was not chaos. It was physics, patience, and psychology in motion. At 20,000 feet, pilots had only seconds to react. Every maneuver, every dive, roll, and turn followed the invisible laws of energy and momentum. Overstreet knew this. He'd been trained to think in terms of EM theory, energy maneuverability. The key was to never lose energy. A pilot could trade speed for altitude, or altitude for speed, but never both. The moment you lost energy, you became a target. That was how he stayed alive. When the 8 German fighters attacked, he didn't panic. He kept his Mustang in constant motion, forcing the enemy to waste energy trying to keep up. By making tight turns, rolling dives, and quick reversals, he made them overshoot. Each overshoot gave him a moment, a single window, to line up a shot. In air combat, that window might last only 2 seconds. But for a skilled pilot, 2 seconds was all that mattered. Inside the cockpit of the P-51B, Overstreet had one major advantage: visibility. The Germans flew Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs and Focke-Wulf WWII-190As, both deadly, but with one flaw: poor rear visibility. The Mustang's canopy, by contrast, gave the pilot a full panoramic view. He could spot enemies sooner. He could predict their moves. He could see when one tried to slip behind him. The Merlin engine gave him another edge: speed and climb rate. If things got too dangerous, he could dive away, gain distance, then climb back for altitude. German fighters, especially the 109, had strong engines, but poor endurance. They were built for short, intense engagements over Germany, not for long chases. That meant Overstreet could outlast them, if he managed his energy well. Air combat manuals taught standard defensive moves, but Overstreet's success came from improvisation. He used 3 key tactics that day: the rolling scissors, a series of twisting, vertical rolls designed to make a pursuing enemy overshoot. The pilot alternates climbing and rolling motions while turning sharply, keeping the enemy guessing. The high yo-yo, a maneuver where the pilot climbs slightly above his opponent during a turn, cutting inside their circle to gain a firing angle. It sacrificed speed for position, something the Mustang could afford to do briefly thanks to its power. The split S, a classic escape move. The pilot rolls inverted, then dives into a half loop to reverse direction quickly. Dangerous at low altitude, but effective against multiple attackers. Overstreet likely used all 3 that day, a blend of skill, instinct, and sheer guts. His success wasn't luck. It was training, executed under unbearable pressure. To the Luftwaffe pilots, the encounter must have been shocking. They were trained for disciplined teamwork. German doctrine emphasized the Rote pair and Schwarm, 4-plane formation. Each pilot had a wingman, and they fought as coordinated units. When they spotted Overstreet's Mustang, they likely believed they had the advantage, 8 against 1. But that assumption cost them. Overstreet broke the rhythm of their formation. He refused to play their game. Instead of engaging head-on or in predictable turns, he darted and twisted unpredictably, forcing the Germans to separate. Once they were split, their numerical advantage evaporated. A post-war interview with Luftwaffe ace Hans-Werner Lerche described similar frustrations. The Americans did not fight like we were taught. They did not stay in formation. They used their speed and their fuel to choose the fight. It was like trying to catch a fox with a broom. Though Lerche didn't reference Overstreet directly, his comment captured the growing fear German pilots felt by 1944. They were no longer hunters. They were being hunted. Imagine Paris in 1944, occupied, controlled by German officers, patrolled by Wehrmacht soldiers. The population lived in fear, but also with quiet defiance. On that afternoon, when the two fighters roared over the Seine, Parisians stopped in their tracks. Some thought it was another German patrol, but when the silver plane, the Mustang, dived under the bridge, they knew it wasn't. Witnesses later described the scene in vivid detail. It was incredible. The American flew so low that the water rippled. The German tried to follow, but he was hit and crashed. We all cheered, quietly, of course, but it was a moment of freedom. One French woman, interviewed years later, said, "We didn't know who he was, but we remembered that silver plane. It was like a message that they had not forgotten us." For Parisians living under occupation, that brief moment in the sky felt like hope. Historians often debate, was Overstreet brave or reckless? Courage and recklessness share a thin border in combat, but what separates them is control. Overstreet didn't dive under the bridge because he wanted glory. He did it because it was his best chance to survive. Pulling up would have exposed his underbelly to the Germans' guns. Turning sharply would have stalled his aircraft at low altitude. The only path open was forward, straight under the arch. And that's what he chose. Pilots who later analyzed the maneuver said that his timing had to be perfect. A miscalculation of even half a second would have smashed the Mustang into the bridge or the river. At 400 miles per hour, there was no room for error. But he made it through. And that, perhaps, was his defining quality: calm under impossible pressure. After Overstreet returned to base, the story spread like wildfire. Even though it wasn't officially written in his mission log, word of mouth carried it through the 357th Fighter Group and beyond. The Oxford boys already had a reputation for fearless flying. Their ranks included future legends like Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier. Among such men, tales of bravery were currency, and Overstreet's feat was the gold standard. Pilots who heard it began calling him the man who flew under the bridge. Some even painted small bridges beneath their Mustang nose art as tribute. But Overstreet himself rarely spoke of it. He didn't boast. He didn't even write it down. To him, it was just another mission, another day he happened to live through. In one later interview, he said, "It wasn't about showing off. It was about getting home. If you're not thinking about that, you won't make it." By 1944, the war in the air was as much psychological as physical. The Luftwaffe had been dominant in the early years, from Poland to France to the Battle of Britain. Their aces were legends: Galland, Marseille, Hartmann. But the tide had turned. The Allies now controlled the skies by numbers and by technology. The Germans still had brilliant pilots, but fewer planes, less fuel, and little hope. Every time a story like Overstreet circulated, it damaged German morale a little more. It told their young pilots that no matter how many of them there were, the Americans couldn't be broken. And for American airmen, such stories became rallying cries. They showed that skill and nerve could overcome impossible odds. Psychological warfare wasn't fought with propaganda leaflets alone. It was fought through stories, through legends of courage that spread faster than any printed message. The Luftwaffe's aircraft were engineering marvels, but limited by resources. By 1944, Germany was producing advanced fighters like the FW-190D Dora and the ME-262 jet, but in small numbers. Their older Bf-10-9s were still the workhorses, though they struggled to match the P-51 at high speed and altitude. The Americans, on the other hand, mass-produced their best machines. By mid-1944, hundreds of Mustangs rolled off the lines every month. Every improvement, from self-sealing fuel tanks to K-14 gun sights, reached the front in weeks, not months. The result was an air force that evolved faster than its enemy. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter. It was the embodiment of industrial power and scientific precision, designed to fly faster, farther, and longer than anything the Axis could field. That technological edge, combined with pilots like Overstreet, turned the tide of the air war. Bill Overstreet's calmness in combat came from training. Relentless, repetitive, exhausting training. American fighter pilots went through nearly 400 hours of flight instruction before combat. They practiced stalls, dives, spins, and emergency landings until the controls felt like extensions of their hands. They trained to think three-dimensionally, always aware of altitude, speed, and position relative to the sun. They learned to anticipate enemy moves, not react to them. As instructors told them, if you can think faster than he can fly, you'll win. German pilots were once trained just as thoroughly, but by 1944, fuel shortages forced cutbacks. Many new Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with fewer than 150 flight hours, barely enough to master takeoffs and landings, let alone survive a Mustang attack. That imbalance, experience versus exhaustion, showed in every dogfight. Overstreet's survival wasn't just skill. It was the product of a system that valued pilot longevity, a rare advantage in wartime. When Overstreet landed that evening at Leiston, procedures followed. Every pilot returning from a mission underwent debriefing, a process that was part intelligence gathering, part therapy. They'd sit in a small tent or hut, still wearing flight gear, sipping coffee as intelligence officers asked questions. What did you see? How many enemy aircraft? Altitude? Direction? Paint? Markings? The goal wasn't just to record kills. It was to build a picture, to track Luftwaffe's strength and tactics day by day. Overstreet likely reported that he'd engaged multiple Messerschmitts over France, claimed one confirmed kill, and possibly a second. He probably didn't mention the bridge. Why? Because such a story sounded too unbelievable for official records. Debriefers focused on coordinates and combat results, not miracles. But the intelligence reports from that day still show increased Luftwaffe losses and sightings near Paris that match his account. Fighter pilots formed a close, almost tribal brotherhood. They lived, ate, and flew together, and mourned together. Losses were constant. The 357th Fighter Group, like most, lost dozens of men each month. When someone didn't return, their bunk stayed empty, their gear untouched for a while. In that grim reality, stories like Overstreet's became more than entertainment. They were morale fuel. A pilot might hear about his friend who didn't make it back. But then someone would tell how Overstreet outflew 8 Germans, and spirits lifted again. It reminded them that survival wasn't luck. It was possible. As Chuck Yeager once said, "In the air, confidence is half the battle." If you believe you can do it, you already have the edge. Overstreet's feat gave others that belief. Captured German pilots later provided fascinating insight. Many expressed genuine admiration for the Mustang and its pilots. One Luftwaffe officer told interrogators, "They fight like madmen. They chase you until there's nothing left to chase. It's not arrogance, it's obsession." Others confessed disbelief at American tactics. They were trained to fight in disciplined formations, but the Americans often fought alone, improvising, adapting mid-battle. To the Germans, this seemed reckless. To the Americans, it was freedom. Overstreet's lone stand symbolized that cultural divide: discipline versus creativity, formation versus instinct. And that difference, historians now agree, shaped the outcome of the air war. News of the Paris dogfight spread quietly through resistance networks. It became a whispered legend. Le pilote américain du pont, the American pilot of the bridge. French underground newspapers referenced it indirectly, describing a duel in the skies above the Seine. For civilians enduring nightly curfews and arrests, it was a spark of defiance. One resistance fighter, later interviewed, said, "We saw it as proof that the Allies were close. If an American could fly over Paris in daylight and defeat the Germans, then liberation could not be far." Indeed, only 4 months later, in August 1944, Allied forces liberated Paris. The memory of that silver Mustang had not faded. Every aerial victory came with a price. Overstreet survived that mission, but many of his comrades did not. The air war over Europe was one of attrition. For every hero's story, there were dozens who vanished into the clouds and never returned. By war's end, more than 26,000 American airmen had been killed in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe's losses were even higher. In that brutal arithmetic, courage wasn't measured in medals, but in moments. Moments like flying under a bridge to stay alive. Moments like refusing to give up when the odds were 8-1. Those moments defined men like Overstreet. Decades later, when aviation historians compiled oral accounts from World War II veterans, Overstreet's story resurfaced again and again. Pilots described it as the ultimate test of nerve. Some doubted its truth until French witnesses confirmed it after the war. Others said it didn't matter, because the spirit of the story captured the essence of what flying meant in that era. Freedom, courage, defiance. In 2011, a restored P-51 Mustang bearing the name Berlin Express appeared at airshows in his honor. When it took off, the announcer would tell the story, and the crowd would fall silent, imagining that day over the Seine. For a few minutes, history would live again. By any measure, Bill Overstreet's survival was improbable. By every measure, it was extraordinary. He combined skill, instinct, and engineering brilliance to turn certain death into triumph. But his story also represented something larger, the triumph of ingenuity, of determination, and of belief in one's machine. It was not merely about a dogfight. It was about the human spirit that refuses to surrender, even when surrounded by enemies. The Mustang pilot, who outflew 8 German fighters, reminded both friend and foe that victory often begins not with superior numbers, but with superior will.